Welcome to Coffee Tasting 101, the home coffee tasting experience from Unleash Coffee. This is the second webinar in our on-demand home coffee series. We will not be going over brew methods in this webinar, so if you haven't already completed the Coffee Brewing 101 course, then you should stop this recording now and go do so. You will want to have dialed in your preferred brewing method before embarking on this tasting experience in order to get the best flavor out of the coffees in your kit. Speaking of your kit, let's take a look at what's in that. All right, let me make this a little bit bigger. Okay, in your kit, you should have 3 different coffees. Okay, they may or may not be these same exact ones, but 3 coffees in your kit. Okay, you will also have some of these pour over filters, and I included these just in case maybe you're out of pour over filters, or maybe you haven't quite dialed in your kit, your brewing. But what you're going to do is you're just going to put that over the top of your mug. You'll put the coffee in there and then use the water. Now, if you have already dialed in your own brewing method from the previous course, you don't need to use these. They're just an extra just in case you need them. Okay. Then the next thing that you're going to have in your kit is your SCA coffee flavor wheel. So this is the standard for specialty coffee worldwide about the different flavors and aromas that you may be getting off of the tastings and the experience today. So as you're going through the coffee tasting experience, compare what you're tasting to the chart, see if you can pick out some of those flavors, and then you're going to jot them down on the tasting log. Okay, so here you've got your 3 coffees listed, and this will be filled in on yours, and then there's 3 spots for you to go ahead and put your tasting notes. Now, don't flip it over, but on the back, really quickly, there are the tasting flavor notes that have been provided by the farmers and Q graders, including me, who have tasted these coffees before you. Okay, but don't peek. Please don't peek, because if you peek, you'll be surprised at how much of a bias seeing what other people found will create in your own coffee tasting experience. So don't look at the back until after you've tasted and compared notes with the color wheel, with the flavor wheel, and jotted down what you have found in your cup. Okay. All right. So today's procedure, this is what we're going to do. What I want to do is give you plenty of time to brew each coffee with the brewing method that you have chosen. So while you brew each coffee, I'm going to take you on a quick journey to see the farming and processing methods of the coffees represented in your kit. If these little quick trips to the coffee belt happen to finish before your brewing finishes, or if you want a little bit more time to taste the coffee before we move on to the next one, please feel free to pause the video before we head off to the next stop. All right, let's get started. The first coffee in your kit is a sun-grown, naturally processed coffee. So let's take a look. With very few exceptions, all the coffee trees grown throughout the world are in the tropical regions between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Most coffee-growing countries have distinct dry and rainy seasons. Trees are planted during the wet season because digging holes is easier and the roots are able to spread throughout the moist soil. The typical lifespan of the Arabica coffee species is about 25 to 30 years, but it does take the first 4 years for seedlings to mature into fruit-bearing shrubs. Once the plant starts flowering, it will begin to produce fruit. From its first flower to ripe fruit takes about 9 to 11 months, depending on varietal and the regional climate influences. The Arabica species is sensitive to wind and high temperatures, so it grows best in higher altitudes between 1,000 and 2,000 meters above sea level. Left on their own devices, the Arabica trees will grow upwards of 16 feet tall, so consistent pruning is needed to help the bottom of the plant fill in and have the height of the tree remain accessible for picking. Because Arabica needs to grow at higher elevations, the terrain tends to be hilly and steep in many coffee-growing regions. Therefore, most Arabica coffee must be harvested by hand. However, there are some growing regions like Brazil that have softer rolling hills, making it easier for coffee cherries to be machine harvested. Brazil is the largest coffee-growing country in the world, and its climate and topography lend itself well to growing coffee in full sun. Sun-grown coffee often provides higher yields and lower production costs. With the direct access to sunlight, coffee plants in sun-grown farms can photosynthesize more efficiently, resulting in faster growth and increased production. For a good portion of the year, coffee farmers work hard on pruning, soil control, soil acidity correction, fertilization, and the maintaining of pest, disease, and weed control. Then it is time for harvest preparation, harvesting, drying, and storing, and milling. In the natural or dried process, the seeds are left inside the cherries to dry by turning them on raised beds or concrete patios for about 2 to 3 weeks until the moisture level gets down to about 11%. The fruit stays on the seed until it is time to get the coffee ready to ship. The coffee is then hulled, which removes both the fruit pulp and the parchment layer at the same time. The natural processing method is more environmentally friendly as there is no water waste or water pollution contribution. It is used in regions like Brazil where there is less rainfall and water conservation is important. What can we expect as far as flavor with this processing method? Because the fruit pulp is left on the seed for processing, naturally processed coffee tends to be more complex in flavor with sweeter, fruitier notes and a heavier body. All right, if you haven't done so already, it's time to taste that first coffee and see what flavors you pick out. So refer to your flavor wheel from the SCA and jot down what you taste in that coffee on your tasting log. Okay. Next up, here we go. Next coffee in your kit is a shade-grown coffee that was done with a washed process. See if you can see the differences that the farming and processing methods for this coffee make in the flavor in your cup. Let's take a look. Shade-grown coffee promotes environmental sustainability. The canopy of trees provides a natural habitat for migratory birds and acts as a carbon sink, helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and combat climate change. Additionally, shade-grown coffee farms contribute to conservation of biodiversity as they support a variety of plant species and wildlife. In high elevation with shady conditions, the maturation of coffee cherries is slower than its sun-grown counterparts. Although this provides less yield, it oftentimes presents more flavorful notes. Because of the steep terrain, coffees here must be picked by hand, making it more likely that only the perfectly ripe cherries are harvested. In the washed method, cherries are picked and brought to the washing station within 8 to 12 hours of harvest and milled to separate the fruit from the seed. This pulping process only removes the flesh of the cherry, not the mucilage layer that coats the bean. The removal of the mucilage is usually done by way of fermentation, which is a process of microbial growth. In the wet process, the coffee sits in fermentation tanks for anywhere between 12 to 72 hours. The duration of time is determined by a combination of factors such as the condition of the beans, the climate, and the altitude. During this soaking period, the beans undergo a controlled fermentation process that helps break down the sugars, remove the mucilage, and any unwanted flavors. This part of the process is an important part of flavor development and can produce a very clean acidity in the cup. Once the fruit pulp is removed and the fermentation is complete, the seeds are washed to remove any excess mucilage and then dried on patios or raised beds for about 2 weeks. The remaining parchment layer stays on the seeds as they rest in the warehouse for up to 3 months. Then they are dry milled to remove the parchment layer in preparation for export. Unlike the dried process, the wet process requires huge quantities of water. The water used in washing process can contaminate groundwater and drinking water if not properly handled. What can we expect as far as flavor with this processing method? The wet process or wash processed method tends to create quite consistent coffees that are cleaner and have a more delicate acidity than the naturally processed coffees. With the wet process, you may find more floral, caramel, and fruity notes, while dry processed beans may be more buttery and nutty. Okay, once again, it's time to taste the second coffee and see what flavors you can pick out. Jot them down on your tasting card. All right, folks, we have one more stop to make on our tour, but this time we won't be headed to the coffee belt, but instead you'll be joining me in the roasting room. Although the farming and processing has a lot to do with the final flavor in your cup, so does the roasting. This is the final step before the coffee gets to you, the brewer. The last coffee in your kit is roasted darker than the rest. Let's take a look at how the roast level affects the flavor in your cup. Getting coffee from the farm to your cup is like passing a baton, accumulating the collective skill of all the previous members of the supply chain each step along the way. If the baton is dropped in this last leg, then the work of every person before it is all for naught. This is why, for the home brewer, the roasting stage of the marathon may be the most important in the chain of events from farm to cup. As a roaster and a licensed Arabica Q grader, I buy coffee beans based on several factors, flavor, of course, being a pretty important one. Green coffee samples are examined for defects, roasted and cupped for quality, and graded against global standards for fragrance and aroma, flavor, aftertaste, acidity, body, uniformity, balance, sweetness, and clean cup. An equally important factor for Unleashed Coffee is working directly with the farmers who grow the coffee, as well as social and environmental sustainability practices. Once the coffee is in hand, it is the skill of the roaster that shapes the final piece of the coffee's flavor profile. To understand how the roasting process affects the flavor in the final cup, let's follow the beans in a typical roasting cycle. When the beans are dropped into a preheated roaster, they are warmed rapidly and moisture within the beans begins to move toward the surface and evaporate. The moisture content will typically drop from about 11% to 2% in the first 5 to 7 minutes of the roast. This is known as the drying phase, and it is visually marked by a change in color from green to a yellowish orange and eventually to a cinnamon color. It is also marked by the smell of grass and hay. This phase is an important step in the development of sweetness, acidity, and bitterness. Next comes a set of chemical changes called the Maillard reaction, and it occurs between 150 and 310 degrees Fahrenheit. This stage has the browning effects from interactions between amino acids and sugars and is marked by the scent of baked bread. Then the caramelization phase begins and the beans release more moisture and carbon dioxide, putting pressure on the structure of the beans. Caramelization occurs between 275 and 390 degrees Fahrenheit. Eventually, the pressure buildup causes the bean to snap, which is known as first crack. Flavor is the combination of the Maillard reaction and caramelization, and although coffee is fit for consumption by the end of first crack, the time remaining between this point and the end of the roast is the development time where the roaster determines how light, medium, or dark the roast becomes. Because the beans themselves are now giving out heat energy, the roaster needs to pay close attention to this exothermic process. This is the phase in the roast that can quickly get out of control and can make or break the flavor profile for each batch. If the roast is stopped at the end of first crack, it would be considered a light roast and will usually be bright and fruity, showcasing the flavor nuances from the varietal and the terroir. If the roast continues, we enter the medium roast zone. You could expect flavors to include deeper fruit flavors with nutty overtones. Next, we enter the medium dark to dark roast stage. Coffee at this level would be more aromatic with flavors of caramelized sugars and more dark chocolate notes. Any roast past about 450 degrees Fahrenheit hits what's known as second crack. This is where coffee begins to smell smoky and become charred in flavor. The coffee also becomes oily at this point. Now, every roaster will have their own signature and definition of what their light, medium, and dark roasts are, but at Unleashed Coffee, you won't find any dark roasts that go past second crack. As a final note, let's talk about how flavor works. A cup of coffee is not inherently sweet, for when coffee is brewed, it has less than 0.1% of naturally occurring sugars. However, the familiar sweet aromatics that are created during roasting, coupled with the trace amounts of complex caramels and sugars, provide a perception of sweetness in the cup. Bitterness tends to be the common scapegoat for bad tasting coffee, but many times it isn't actually bitterness on the palate, but rather astringency or sourness. The right amount of bitterness can actually be a good thing because it does a great job of focusing the sweetness and taming the acidity when balanced correctly. Roasting beyond second crack or over extraction during brewing can both bring out unfavorable bitterness. Acidity is important to a good cup of coffee because this is the element that provides the fruitiness and the juiciness. Aroma, body, and mouthfeel are also important parts of coffee tasting. Retronasal smell, combined with the sensory input from the tongue for taste, texture, and temperature, enable the brain to devise an accurate representation of the coffee. All right, guys, by now you know the drill. If you haven't done so already, compare your flavors with the flavor wheel and jot them down. Then what I want you to do is compare the flavor notes that you wrote down on the front side to what is listed on the back side of the log sheet, and see if you picked out the same flavors as the Q graders and the farmers who have tasted this before you. Were you able to pick out the differences between the farming and processing methods? Could you taste that flavor difference in your cup? What about the roast level? Okay, I hope that you had some fun today and that you learned something new along the way. Now that you have completed Brewing 101 and this home tasting experience, my hope for you is that you will be able to make better, more enjoyable coffee at home. Remember, not every coffee is for every palate. So if you didn't find the perfect match for you today, it's okay. Check out our website for our current selection and see what we've got. There's always about 12 coffees in our portfolio, and it lists all of the flavor profiles and the farming methods and information right there on our website. All you got to do is click on the website or scan the the QR code on the front of the package. It's on the front of the package of these guys too. Front of the package, and it will bring that information up for you. So click on that website or the QR code and find your perfect match. All right, guys, if you're ready to up your brewing game by one more notch, join me for the final webinar in this series, Home Espresso 101. Scan the QR code or find the link that's somewhere around this video and click to enroll. Until next time, cheers.